Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Read, and this is going to be a wrap-up of the fiction that I've read over the past week. The first thing that I picked up was also probably the best thing that I read this week, and that was The Bus by Adam Pottle. This is set in Nazi-era Germany and follows a group of patients or prisoners, depending on how you want to frame it, who are being taken from an institutional environment to a quote-unquote hospital where they are going to be gassed. This is told through the voices of several of the patients, as well as a psychiatrist who works at the place where they're going to be murdered, and the man who runs the crematorium at that place. It is absolutely heartbreaking, both because you know what's happening, and in part just because I think when we talk about fiction that touches on Holocaust issues, you very rarely see work that looks so squarely and so particularly and clearly at the disability side of things. I think a lot of the popular fiction tends to look at Jewish, Roma, and maybe gay experiences, and this is honestly, I think, the first work I've seen that looked specifically at that, and particularly from the perspective of people involved. But on an artistic level, I thought this was just brilliant. The author does a great job of really differentiating the voices of the different characters. The psychiatrist does not sound like the crematorium worker. The different characters have very distinct voices from each other, and not in a way that I think is excessively stereotypical, because I think when you are writing characters who are dealing with mental illness and developmental disabilities, it's very easy to use stereotyped speech ideas as a shorthand to indicate what's going on, and he doesn't do that, which I thought was fantastic. There are a couple of characters whose voices we hear who are not necessarily disabled. One of the characters is an actress who had been involved in political plays and was declared mentally incompetent, basically as a political move. Another one is a man who decided to pretend being insane to avoid having to join the military, and he recognizes his mistake there because at this point he's already been sterilized, and he is the one person who basically realizes that they're probably going to be killed. So the hopelessness of that is pretty depressing. But it doesn't do what I think a lot of people try to do when they deal with institutional environments, which is to suggest that it's horrible because the people who are sane or of average intelligence are suffering in this environment, because that is not what this is saying. It's saying this is horrific for everyone involved. And I don't want to act like I thought I enjoyed this just because I thought it was important, because I thought this was incredibly well done in terms of the voices and the storytelling that went on with this. So yeah, I thought this was really spectacular. I would strongly recommend that if you have the opportunity that you pick this up. Next up, I read The Queen of Crows by Myke. This is the sequel to a book that I talked about in my last fiction wrap-up. This one did exactly what I hoped was going to happen with the last one, in that it took off with the two battle sequences that we got at the end of that one, and it ran with it. And this is basically super entertaining. It is packed with action. We get to see first a city siege, and then we get to see the defense of that city. We see a mixture of magics and medieval type military tactics. We see a bit more of the travelers, who are kind of the pseudo-Roma culture that's in this society, which was interesting. We get to see more of the kind of political differences in the military that's opposing our heroes in this story, and that a lot of them have been conscripted, and what that means in terms of offense and defense, and whether the people are going to stand the line or not. So yeah, this was very entertaining. The one issue that I kind of have in this is something that I mentioned in my review of the last one, which is that I don't think these really stand on their own. This isn't a book that you could really jump into without having read the first one, because it doesn't catch you up with anything, which normally I appreciate in fantasy series, because I think there's a bit too much spoon feeding anyway and a bit too much regurgitation of previously on. But in this case, it really made it feel, because these are so short, you know, maybe they just should have waited and published these as a single book. So it makes me a little cynical, because I feel like, given that fantasy is so full of 600, 700, 800 page novels, I don't know that this needed to be several 200, or in this case 250 page novels instead. Aside from, I suppose, they make more money if you buy 3 books than 1. Yeah, cynicism over the way this was published aside, This was super entertaining, and if you enjoy military fantasy, I definitely suggest that you pick this up because it is great fun. And actually, as something that came up in the comments of the video where I talked about the previous one in this series, I think there are a lot of people who don't read military fantasy who probably would enjoy it, but they stay away because they think it's all macho nonsense. There is certainly some macho nonsense in this, but the main character is female. And I mean, if you're doing the checkboxes, she's also a lesbian and an amputee. And actually there's a lot of deconstruction of gender roles and expectations and contrasted between the different cultures as well within this. So if you're afraid that this is macho nonsense, and that's keeping you away from the action sequence fun of these, don't be afraid. It's not like that. And to be honest, a lot of military fantasy and sci-fi is not necessarily as heavily macho nonsensey as I think people think, because I do talk to a lot of people who just absolutely don't want to read that kind of material, and I kind of understand that when it's realistic fiction and they're making a point about pacifism, which fair enough, but in a fantasy environment, especially for people who enjoy epic fantasy in general, don't be afraid of military fantasy. Next up, I read Bom Boy by Yewande Omotoso. This is a novella that I think would be incredibly straightforward if not for the way it was structured. There are essentially 3 or 4 stories in this. One of them is about a young man in Cape Town in more or less the current day who's working as a programmer and is trying to find out why he's had bad luck in his life. And woven in along with that are the stories of his adoptive father, his biological mother, and his biological father. And interwoven with those stories are also a series of letters that his biological father wrote to him while he was an infant and while the father was in prison prior to his adoption. There is some interesting commentary about family and culture because the main character's father was from Nigeria and had a Yoruba Nigerian father and an English South African mother. He moved to South Africa for university and ended up as a university lecturer, where he ended up marrying one of the cleaning ladies at the university. And the cleaning lady was Cape-colored. The main character is eventually adopted by what seemed to be an English South African family, although the man has a French name. Usually I expect South Africans with French names to be Afrikaans, so maybe he is. But in any case, so there's a lot of issues around culture and family. The curse that the main character thinks that he has inherited based on these letters from his biological father is one that was passing down through the Nigerian Yoruba side of the family, where a great-great-grandparent may have had some dealings with a sangoma that went wrong and had results that they continue to feel until his generation. There's some interesting exploration about family implied, but as I think about this more, I think the main reason this is interesting is because the stories are told in this interwoven way, such that as you are reading this, if you're not careful to look for the bolded headers in between paragraphs, you wouldn't notice when you've changed from one story to another. So when it's jumping between, say, 1992 and 2001 and 2012, because I think I said current day, but it's 2012 in the current part of the story, you wouldn't necessarily notice which was which, because the narrative voice isn't really trying to reflect any of the characters in particular. It's not neutral because we are seeing the characters' thoughts, but there isn't a lot of stylistic differentiation between them. Even though when we get their thoughts, the language is slightly different, so there should be more differentiation. So in a lot of ways this was interesting because of how scattered the different stories were in between each other. But if this were told as, say, 4 parts, and each part was focused on a different section, if one was the story of the parents, if one was the 2012 story, if one was the 2001 story, which is about the main character's adoptive mother dying and what that does to their family unit, I don't think this would be nearly as interesting. And I guess the structure works that way in that it makes you have to think about it more in a way that you wouldn't if it were all together. And I think that means that the subject matter and the plot points and the character points aren't that interesting. So this was interesting, but the more I think about it, the less I'm impressed by it. Because the reason that I thought that it was very challenging and doing interesting things was purely based on the structure. Once you've worked out what the structure is and are paying attention to the different elements, they're not that interesting on their own. Still, from a structural perspective, I thought it was an exercise in a style that we don't see that often, so I did appreciate that. And because it's not particularly long, it was quick to get through. So I was entertained, but I don't necessarily know how good it is as an overall package, as much as it's interesting as an experience while you're reading it. And then finally, I read Book Love by Debbie Tung. This is a graphic novel. Well, calling it a graphic novel is actually probably pushing it. This is really a collection of comic strips. It reminded me a lot of the Sarah Scribbles series in terms of humor, which isn't really my thing. It's amusing, but it doesn't strike me as funny in the way that I think it strikes a lot of people as funny. So I kind of expected to like this more than I did. We'll show you the art style if you're interested. It is a lot of single-page pieces that are like a newspaper comic strip. There's usually 4 panels per page, although some of them mix it up a little bit, but in general it's that format. And each page has its own punchline. There isn't any kind of story, it's essentially a greeting card sentiment regarding being a book lover, which may or may not appeal to you. I think this would appeal. There's a Hallmark channel. People like that kind of sentiment. So if you like that kind of sentiment, and you are specifically a big fan of having physical books, because a lot of the material in here is about enjoying books as items and not just books for reading. It's a lot about book shopping and having physical books and whatnot. So it wasn't necessarily my thing, because I am someone who, every book I've shown you I took out of the library. This one I obviously read as an ebook. I'm not particularly attached to buying and, despite all of this, to buying and owning the physical books and reading the physical books in particular. But if you are, and you like this kind of comic strip humor, if you're a fan of something like the Sarah Scribbles series, this might be right up your alley. For me, it was fine. Because it was a library book, it doesn't matter that I wasn't that impressed, because it's not like I had to pay for it. Well, I hope you've had a good reading week. If you've read any of these or are looking to read any of these, I'd love to hear what you have to say about them. And that's it for now. Ciao.